Okay, live. I'm doing this direct on Facebook and not using another app, so I'm not sure if the audio is working. It says that it is. So if you're watching, go ahead and say something so I can know that it's working because I have indicators saying that it is, but until I have somebody actually comment, uh, I don't actually know. So it's been a while, not for lack of there being things to talk about. Just I've been really busy and I don't really have an incentive to do this unless my muse, makes me want to do it. And I've been close a couple times, but with Porcfest a week away, and I do have a tradition of doing Porcfest pregame videos, not every time, but many times. I thought this would just be as good a reason as any to get on here. I'm not going to be strict about what I will talk about. So if you got any questions, you guys can ask. You guy, single person watching, that's probably me. Yeah, like I said, if you are watching and you can hear the audio, please just make a comment. If you can't hear the audio, well, I'll ask you to make a comment, but I guess you wouldn't be able to hear me say that. So, yeah, Porcfest is in a week from tomorrow is when it begins. It'll be that Monday until the following Sunday, really the following Saturday night, and then Sunday is just people are packing up to go. I've been going for, I think this will be, I haven't gone every time, but the first time I went, I think was in 2012, maybe 2011, but I think 2012. And then I went again in 2013. And 6 months after I went the second time is when I actually moved. And it's been 10 years. I've lived in New Hampshire in the same place for 10 years. Audio is good. Hey, nice to see you, Jared. Good to hear that. I'm not using Streamlabs. I'm just going straight onto YouTube. So I'm glad that works. How you been? How's dad life? So, yeah, obviously, there's been a ton of stuff in the news. A lot of it very interesting. A lot of it kind of unique. The stuff that's happening um, in Ukraine, obviously, the stuff that's happening in Israel with Gaza. I feel like we're kind of getting into new territory with the whole Israel-Palestine thing and the way that it affects politics in the United States. So that's really fascinating. The prosecution of Trump, also quite unprecedented and quite interesting. I'm not sure that I would have a take that's unique to anyone. I have to say, I'm just in general very, very busy. In the idea that I'm going to sit down and make a vlog, it just doesn't have quite as much appeal as it once did. But that doesn't change that this stuff is super interesting. So life is real good. I assume that means you're too busy to go to Porcfest this year, yet again. There's many of you who have been saying you're going to go to Porcfest. Jared, I don't know if this applies to you. I don't remember you ever actually saying that, but many of you have been saying that for better part of a decade now. So, yeah, it's something that I highly recommend everybody do at least once, just to kind of get a feel for it. Also, there are likely going to be changes at Porcfest in the near future. It's been at the same venue pretty much all but 1 or 2 years. Thinking about moving to New Hampshire, probably won't though. Well, we should talk about that, Jared. You should definitely move to New Hampshire. It's the best state. It really is actually the best state by many metrics, and not just libertarian metrics. It's a very low cost of living, but a very high standard of living. A great combination of, you've got mountains, you've got ocean, you've got urban, you've got rural. You can be really in the middle of nowhere, or you can be in a very highly settled, highly developed area. It's very close to much bigger urban centers like Boston that are kind of more culturally mainstream, but you can have the benefit of access to those places without actually having to live there. Boston is a 45-minute drive, depending on the traffic. So it's a place that you can have the advantages of without actually having to live there. And on top of all of that, the Free State movement, although not necessarily always being flashy, has continued to grow and have a increasing effect on politics here, um, to a redounding benefit. So, third lowest tax rate. Okay. Well, we'll work on that. And yeah, no income tax and no sales tax. There's a liquor monopoly. So the state raises a lot of revenue by selling overpriced booze, which has to be said is one of the most regressive forms of taxation that exists, but also one that as a non-drinker, is one that has been to my benefit. And then it also charges tolls on some of the main highways, which is perfectly reasonable and also easily avoidable if you just avoid those main roadways. Really, it's not that bad. It's just a couple of sections, basically up to about Concord, and then after that, there's no more. So, yeah. It's the most educated state. It has the highest IQ, and it also has the lowest crime. Speaking as someone who lives in the most crime-ridden area in the entire state, essentially, it's not that bad. Like, do you think property taxes will be lowered? So, I'm not an expert on this, but from my understanding, and this is something that's not just true in New Hampshire, but in much of New England, that the primary loci of government is at the municipal level, at the town level, the village level. The state governments, especially in northern New England, and especially in New Hampshire, really, especially in New Hampshire, are quite minimal. State budget, by the way, it's one of the few states that has a surplus. They are under, they don't go over budget. And I just read an article that was juxtaposing Vermont and New Hampshire, and it's some ridiculous, like the state budget in New Hampshire is half the state budget in Vermont, but the population in New Hampshire is double the population of Vermont. And yet, by all the metrics that people seem to care about, whether it be education, healthcare, homelessness, roads, and I can say personal experience with roads, that New Hampshire is better than Vermont. And they're almost identically sized states. Vermont is slightly larger by, I think, 500 square miles, which is very small at the scale we're talking about. And they're actually very similarly shaped. Actually, you can see behind me, that's a map of the two, Vermont there and New Hampshire there. They kind of form like a square that's been cut down the middle by the Connecticut River. But the schools are really good, relatively speaking, as far as public schools go. But the locus is really local. The local government, the state government is quite marginal, and the county government also. The counties do exist, but they are like almost superfluous. So that's not necessarily always a good thing. You can have a local tyranny. You can have, a lot of problems with that. And one thing Brian Kaplan talks about in his research on democracy and voting is that, sadly, people don't vote for their so-called best interest. Like, they don't vote in a way that's like, oh, this is going to maximize profits, or especially they do tend to vote ideologically. And ideology in New England, it can vary. It's much worse in, say, Vermont or Massachusetts than it is here. But you still have the feeling that, education is important. And when education is important, that means that the school, the town must have its own school. And it's weird because that isn't true everywhere. There are actually a lot of towns in New Hampshire that don't have at least public high schools or even public middle schools, and they just pay tuition, right? They just say, if your kid from this school, the city will pay your tuition to go to wherever. And there's a couple so-called academies. The largest one is called Pinkerton Academy, and Pinkerton Academy is essentially a private institution. It looks like a college campus if you ever go there. It's a very large, multi-building place. But then their students, you can pay private tuition. So there are people who just send their kids there. There was a kid in my jujitsu class who was from a town that was quite far from there, but his parents liked that school, so they just paid for him to go. But if you were from, I think it's 5 or 6 different towns, including some large towns, they will just pay for you to go there. It's cheaper for the towns. They don't have to pay for the buildings. They don't have to be saddled with the pensions and the healthcare and all that. And then they just pay a fixed rate. And then the school can just look at it like every kid is worth this much per year. And they can make a calculus based on this. And Pinkerton is a fine school as far as schools go. Is also by far the largest school in the state, I think by a factor of 2. Like the next biggest school is half the size. But another town that I'm familiar with, because so many of the people from that town go to my gym, is a town called Bedford, and Bedford is one of the cities that touches Manchester. It's one of the suburbs of Manchester, and it's a wealthy suburb. You have the property, and the property taxes there are very high, and that kind of keeps certain types of people out. And Bedford, similar to many other towns, did not have a high school. They didn't have a middle school. Their students, the town paid tuition for them to actually go to another public school, one of the Manchester high schools. There's a high school very close to me that they used to go to, and they paid them, I think it was something like $9,000 a year per student to go to this Manchester high school. And back in the early 2000s or the mid 2000s, the school district in Manchester said, we're going to raise tuition from $9,000 to $12,000. And if that wasn't bad enough, they also said that even though Bedford was paying probably a lot of money per year, I don't know, I do the math, they have about 1,000. So yeah, probably would have been over $1 million a year, something like that. Maybe less at the time. I don't know what the population was at the time, but it would have been in the hundreds of thousands or $1 million a year, let's say. You also wouldn't have any voting rights. Like they couldn't have any say in how the school was administered. And so Bedford said, we're going to build our own high school, and we're going to have our own school district, which they did. It's been there since 2007. And it cost far, 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 far more than just paying the increased tuition. I mean, orders of magnitude more. The school itself cost tens of millions of dollars. The service on the debt is going to cost probably more than $1 million a year for the better part of the next, many decades. The operating costs are gigantic per year. So like and that's that's the biggest tax burden on the people who live there. And that's administered by the town. It's going to come in your property taxes, which are so high that it prohibits a lot of people from living there. It might be, in a perverse way, it might be what the point of the school is. It's funny. Brian Kaplan also, I've been reading a lot of his stuff lately. Also talks about it's this weird virtue signaling when it comes to education. Education is great. It's the best thing ever. We should spare no expense. There should be no question about how much we spend on it. But then if you talk about expanding the number of kids in a school and say, well, it's so great, why don't we build a whole bunch of apartment complexes and we can have even more kids? They would say, oh, no. So it's this weird thing. And it kind of very realistically in certain situations, certainly in the case of Bedford, it kind of puts a limit on how many people can even live there, what types of people can live there, which a cynic would say that's the reason they're doing it. I actually don't think that's true. I think it's just that they're virtue signaling how much they care about education. So yeah, but you're not going to have nearly as onerous a state government. Your state taxes are going to be very small. A lot of that's coming from tolls and from vice taxes. There are taxes on things like if you buy a meal at a restaurant or hotels, but if you live here, you wouldn't be staying at too many hotels. So, New Hampshire and Texas have the same property tax rates. Pretty wild. Yeah, especially considering logistically how different they are. If you think about Texas, it's obviously a vast, vast state. New Hampshire is a very small state, a much more capital intensive per acre, probably a much higher population density, although New Hampshire is a small population, it's also a small area. So I don't actually know what the density would be. It would probably be less than Texas, I would guess. But Texas has multiple major cities, which we don't have in New Hampshire. Let's see. Have you ever met Stixenhammer in real life? No, Stixenhammer doesn't live in New Hampshire. Or he doesn't live in the United States anymore. as long as I've known about him, and I don't really watch his stuff, but he's lived in the Netherlands. But I know that he's originally from Rutland, and Rutland, if you look on the map above me, you see that little green bump right there. That's where Rutland is, and I've been to Rutland many, many, many times in the course of my work, but I've certainly never met him. Favorite book on the history of Europe? Oh goodness. That's too hard. I mean, honestly, there's too many. And the way that's phrased, like a book that covers all the history of Europe, which is, I mean, just 'cause it's like having a book on world history. There, like, it's very hard to do that topic justice. Um, so if I'm going to keep, like, if you're going to say just any book that's about history per se, that might be easier. But no. Hey, long time no see. Nice hair. Thanks. So I'm not in love with the hair. I'll be honest. I don't actually like the way that it looks. And it's annoying. It takes a lot more time to wash and to clean. It gets in your way. It gets in your face when you're lifting. You inhale it when you eat it. You fork it. Gets in your eyes. You can't drive with the windows down in the car without using a ponytail, which you have to now have ponytail bands and blah blah blah. And I really don't like it, but I've never had it long, so I decided to grow it out and see what that experience is like. And one of the unforeseen consequences is that a lot of women really, really like it, and I've been hit on by more women in the few short years that I've had this hair, really the last year or two, than in my entire previous life. Uh, I don't think it's all women, but there's certain types of women who just love long hair, and the flirting has been unprofessional in many. I deal with a lot of nurses, but even at the gym, just walking down the street, even I've gotten cat calls on the street. So wasn't expecting that. I don't understand it. I've been told that I would make a really good bartender and that I would get really good tips from women. So don't know what that is. I don't know what other people's experiences on that. This is kind of uncharted territory for me. There is a certain once it gets to a certain length over a year or two, you start to feel like you don't want to cut it because you've put all this effort into it. And it's, even though it's not really effort. And then of course you see people who are bald or going bald, which obviously I'm not. And then you feel like, well, I might as well enjoy it while I can. Still haven't found any gray hairs despite, passing 40 a couple years ago. So I guess that's good. I'll flaunt it while I have it. Have you read Kaplan's book on housing? No, but I do have it. It's on my bookshelf back there. So I will take a look at that. Did you hear that David Boaz died? I did hear that David Boaz died. I'll be honest, I'm not to speak ill of the dead. Not the biggest fan of his. Not that there's anything particularly horrible about him, but he's kind of the milk toast libertarian. So I guess that's fine, but I wasn't like the hugest advocate of him. He's kind of, I know that he's, he was gay, but that doesn't mean anything. I don't care. I guess he used to date Tom Palmer at one point. Don't remember if I ever saw David Boaz on Grindr. I definitely saw Tom Palmer on Grindr a few times at a couple events. I don't think I did David Boaz. But I guess RIP. I think I heard that Styx moved back to Vermont after he and his wife drove. That may be, but Vermont is a low population, relatively small state. That does not mean that you will bump into just random people going there. But Vermont is, really, it's a nice. It's like the United States and the UK and the USSR. You can just really, or North and South Korea or East and West Germany. The two states are very similar. They have very similar climates. I would say essentially identical climates. They have very similar topographies. They're both overwhelmingly mountainous, but they both also have. So in New Hampshire, the southeast section on the coast is flatter and more amenable to agriculture, along as a very narrow strip along the Connecticut River. And you can actually see it in that image. You see this green area. That's the west side of Vermont along the Lake Champlain, and that's also a very agriculturally friendly area. So the states are very, very, very similar in that way. It will be similar types of agriculture, similar amounts of agriculture. You could say that. I mean, New Hampshire has a seacoast, which Vermont doesn't, although it does have access, I think, to the sea through the Connecticut River and also through Lake Champlain, although I could be wrong about that. But the state government is much more socialist in Vermont, and everything is worse there. The taxes are higher. There are punitive taxes. So because there's no sales tax in New Hampshire, there is a huge amount of cross-state traffic and even cross-border traffic of people coming to New Hampshire to buy stuff. If you go to the border with Massachusetts, which Massachusetts is by far the largest state population-wise in the area, the hub of New England is clearly Boston. Boston is the heart of New England. It has been since the early 17th century. But every day, hundreds of thousands or even more people from Massachusetts, maybe not every day, tens of thousands, come to New Hampshire to buy their TVs and buy their cars and do all their shopping. So there's a whole bunch of malls right on the border that are far larger than the towns would suggest. So Salem, Nashua is probably a city a lot of people have heard of, very much like that. But even on the border with Vermont, you get it it's a lesser extent because Vermont has fewer people. But because that happens, because it's just logical and rational to assume many people in Vermont are crossing into New Hampshire to buy things, that the state of Vermont, if you live within a certain radius of the border, will charge you a punitive tax. It depends. It's graded on your income, but something like for a regular person is going to be something like $1,500 a year, on the assumption that you're not paying sales tax because you're going to New Hampshire. But there's a good part. You don't have to pay it if you can prove that you didn't buy anything in New Hampshire. And for those of you questioning how you can prove that you didn't buy something, good question. So, so people who live on some of those border towns, I had a friend who lived in White River Junction, which is on the Vermont side of the Connecticut River across from West Lebanon and Hanover, which is where Dartmouth is. And he worked in New Hampshire. And I thought, why don't you just move? Like, you would have the same job, but your cost of living would go way down, but your standard of living would go way up. But he was a hippie. So to him, it was like, no, Vermont is better because it's, more socialist, even though even the government run services are better in New Hampshire. And I'll say, as somebody who has driven at this point something like 250 or 300,000 miles between the two states, and in the winter, New Hampshire is very good about keeping the roads clear in winter. And they also are philosophically better too, where if it's really, really bad, they won't actually close the roads. They'll just say, hey, you're on your own. But if you want to use them, go right ahead. Whereas Massachusetts will just close and be like, it's a state crime. You can't go on the road because we told you. Massachusetts won't even let you buy sparklers. It's the only state that doesn't allow sparklers. But Vermont, for all their tax burden that they put on their people, they don't even plow the roads at night. Like the state highway will not plow their two main highways at night. And I'm like, what are you paying the high taxes for then? So it's just better in every way. Sticks maybe move back. Have you read Norman Davies's book on the history of Europe? I don't think so, but I don't always remember the names of the authors of the books that I kind of more remember the titles, but probably not. Have you ever looked into near-death experiences? Not seriously. Chicks think you're Fabio. That has been explicitly raised, that I look like I can't believe it's not butter guy, who they did not realize was Fabio. So I don't think that's flattering because I don't really find him attractive. Boaz didn't consider Rothbard a top libertarian. Well, so there always was, and still is a long-standing feud between Rothbard and the Mises Institute and Cato and Reason. Rothbard was involved with the creation of Cato. He was one of the founding members. I think that they had some kind of shares, and he had some of them, and then they had a falling out. I don't want to just take Rothbard's sides, but it sounds very personal, and maybe there was a lot of pettiness involved. But it kind of got. I mean, after Rothbard died, you still had people like Ed Crane, who was a longtime head of the Cato Institute. He may still be. I don't know. Who were basically continued to shit on him forever. And you can disagree with him, and I disagree with Rothbard about plenty of things. And there's lots of things to say about his personal character. And even Kaplan will say this. Kaplan doesn't agree with him a lot because, but I'll readily admit the guy was a brilliant genius. Like he was obviously highly intelligent and made a lot of good points. But some of those Cato guys will just not acknowledge any of that. They'll just pretend like he's a total nobody. And, and I would take his body of work and compare it favorably to anyone. And that's not to say I agree with him on all the time or he was right on every point. That's not true. Or that he couldn't himself be petty because he could. And anyone read his stuff about Israel Kirzner, you see what I'm talking about. But like, my scalp is thinning, but I've been using Rogaine. Cinefan, my conception of you is that you're 12. Now, I know you haven't been 12 for about a decade or more. So that's kind of upsetting, I guess. I don't know. What do you think about Trump being found guilty of falsifying business records? Yeah. And having them elevated to felonies based on a crime that was never specified. The idea that presidents or ex-presidents even should be above the law is a horrible idea. And many of them, including all the living ones with the possible exception of Jimmy Carter, and even then, are guilty of crimes and should be punished. It may be the case that justice at this point for them would just be some kind of symbolic guilt and that they won't get what they truly. I mean, George Bush deserves the worst punishments that can be given. And really, so does Barack Obama. And, I would say that Clinton is at a lower level than them, but I think mostly because he was such a petty criminal that he didn't use his political power to do all the. Okay, so he did Waco. I mean, they're all very, very, very bad. But they're not going after Trump for actual crimes. They're not going after him for things that they should do. And I don't think there's any question that this is an equal application of the law. And for the DA there to talk about nobody's above the law, I think there was a Babylon Bee article that satirized his comments. Nobody is above the law that I just made up 10 minutes ago, right? It's totally hypocritical. They will never apply this to Democrats. They never will apply it to Hillary Clinton. They'll never apply it to Joe Biden. They'll never apply it to any of them. And the idea that, Glenn Greenwald has pointed this out. Donald Trump will just automatically be found guilty in Manhattan. That's just the way it is there. And even not in Manhattan. I mean, the people I know who hate Trump no matter where they live, and they would feel like it was their duty to convict him, and they would also just predispose to just automatically believe anything against him. I don't think it's going to help them at all. His supporters don't care. It's so transparently. I just heard Sam Harris today even say that the chart, it was a huge misstep to do this. Not that it necessarily will cost them the election, but it might. I mean, it's just patently true that he's getting. I mean, and there's a certain mendacity here because you have people who hate Trump who are saying things like, "We have to stop him no matter what." He's the biggest threat to whatever it takes. We'll do anything that matters, and then they'll pretend like that this was a fair trial and that this was just the justice system working, even though all the evidence is that it was politically motivated. Right? Just even like the timing, the amount of time it takes for this to go to trial, that they're clearly trying to get this to happen before the election. And I don't think it's going to help them. I think that they're delusional, just like always when it comes to Trump, that they have Trump derangement syndrome, and they think that the acolytes and applause of the people with Trump derangement syndrome is going to make a difference, and it's not. Boop boo. Do you think you will ever be married? I don't know. We'll see. Do you think that Ukraine can win? You've been pretty pro-Ukraine in the past. Yes, I do, because contrary to what a lot of people, and this is not a sanguine, like, the victorious underdogs, but the fact is that Russia has not only lost multiple wars within the last century, it has imploded as a country 2 or 3 times, depending on how you count it, from wars, during war. So you could say the fall of the Soviet Union was over determined. There were so many things going up against the Soviet Union for it to fall apart. But one of the things was the Afghanistan war, right? In terms of its cost, in terms of money, and its drain on the budget, but also the lives. But Russia, the Russian Empire, collapsed fighting World War I. It collapsed, had a revolution, essentially fighting a war with Japan that it lost in 1905, 1904, 1905. By the way, that war was the peace treaty for that war was signed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and got Teddy Roosevelt, the most martial president we probably ever have, a well-deserved peace prize. The president who actually deserved a peace prize, unlike Barack Obama. It collapsed in World War I, and then it collapsed again because people often forget there were 2 revolutions in 1917. There was an anti-Tsarist revolution that eventually brought the provisional government and Kerensky to power. And then there was another revolution in November. They call it the October Revolution because they use the Julian calendar instead of the Gregorian calendar. And that also was largely brought about by the fact that the Kerensky government continued to prosecute the war. So Russian society has collapsed multiple times in the course of war. Now, I'm not saying that will happen in this case, only that it can. So the framing of your question is it possible? The answer is absolutely, it's possible. Now, what are the odds? I don't know. Like, there's other things too, that Russia has not really figured out a transfer of power. Really, they had this problem under the czars. The czars fixed it by being a dynasty, by having this order of succession, and having this Romanov dynasty, and before that the Rurik dynasty. And although a lot of people describe Putin as a czar, and he even apparently describes himself as a czar, he's not a czar. There is no dynasty. He doesn't have any legitimate children, I don't believe, and they're not in the public spotlight. And if something were to happen to him, even if he didn't die, but he just became really old, his daughter who lives in the Netherlands is not going to show up and like, I'm the new Putin. So I don't, and the other thing too is that Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's far smaller. It's half the size of population. It's 1.5 million square miles, smaller. And I think that the idea that the sanctions were going to just, like, slam on the brakes and destroy the Russian economy like in a week were obviously wrong. But long term, it is having a problem. And the other thing too is that people underestimate that the Soviet Union had created this enormous arsenal of weaponry, of tank shells, of tanks, of all this stuff. That's the 45% of the Soviet economy was geared to their military industrial complex. If you look at the United States, the height of the Cold War, it wasn't that. It was like 6 or 7%. That was like the United States was getting into like the 20 or 30% category during World War II, like during the war. And just imagine the Soviet Union basically stayed at that level, like in perpetuity. And those material goods, I mean, many of them were destroyed, many of them were sold, but these vast stockpiles, by far the largest stockpiles in the world for lots of this types of equipment, were created. and they've been burning through all that, and they had enough to last a couple years, but it looks like that's going to run out. And they are producing; they are going to increase their production, but the increase is not going to make up for the losses. So there's many problems for Ukraine. That they're obviously taking huge casualties. They're paying an enormous price. We're paying an enormous price. Europe's paying it, but is also paying a big price. But I think a lot of Europeans. This isn't really true for America. America is pretty. We really do have splendid isolationism here. We don't need to be worried about Russia's on our border, or Chinese on our borders for that matter. That's different for the Europeans, and they have the wherewithal if they can get their shit together, which in a lot of ways NATO and the United States have kind of prevented. You could say, and I mean, many neocons would say that NATO and the United States has kept the peace, so to speak. And maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But one of the consequences is most of these European states substantially demilitarized to the point where they're unrecognizable, and they're not anywhere close to like what maybe they need, because a lot of what they needed was provided by us, by the Americans. So yeah, it just looks like, I mean, if you think about the war in Ukraine is 3 years old. 3 years was the amount of time it took the Soviets to go from Stalingrad to Berlin. Okay. And we're talking about, they haven't even taken all of the Donbass yet. They don't even have all of Luhansk. People talk about, oh, they're gaining ground. It's like weeks and weeks and weeks, and they're taking 100, like a hectare here, a hectare there. They lost over 1 million people leaving. So I think the war was incredibly stupid, and that doesn't mean it won't be destructive. Jordan Peterson kind of is like, well, if you think that everything's going to be fine and dandy, and Ukraine is just going to get everything back, and everyone's going to be happy, you're going to be wrong. Well, yeah, that's true. It's not going to be like that, but it doesn't seem like they have the ability to just take even all the oblasts that they wanted. And the ruble has been slowly losing more and more purchasing power. They're in this weird relationship with China where they're kind of becoming like a satellite or a puppet of China, which I know they don't want. But by the way, the reason that there's never been like a challenger to the dollar as the world reserve currency, the reason that that has never happened and never will happen is because it would require the other countries to subordinate themselves to one. They'd basically have to subordinate themselves to China, and they're just not willing to do that. So, and there's no sign that. So, yeah, I don't. It would be nice, and I'll admit, I don't know if I made videos about this, but after the Kharkiv counteroffensive, it was easy to think, hey, maybe just one more push and kick them out of Ukraine, and like there might have been a chance of that, but the Ukrainians didn't have, and it's not just that they didn't have enough Western supplies; like they just didn't have the capacity in their military to do that. I mean, given the fact that they're fighting long odds and have had one hand tied behind their back, I think they've done pretty well. But yeah, the problem is for the Russians, who look at this like they're going to unify Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are really just Russians. Let's just even assume, for the sake of argument, that that's true, and that all this stuff about Ukrainian nationalism is like made up or retro, and there is some of that. Like there are people who will go and point to things that are like 1,000 years old and be like, see, Ukraine has always been a country because the Kiev and Rus was founded in 9/11 or whatever. And okay, like that's how relevant is that today? Is a very good question. Like modern Ukrainian nationalism is much newer. A distinct Ukrainian language that is self-consciously Ukrainian language is relatively new. That doesn't mean it's not real. They're not mutually intelligible, so I'm satisfied they're different languages. But even if none of that was true, the fact that you're doing the war and they're fighting against you is giving them an identity. right? Let's just say that there was no independent Ukrainian identity before February 2022. There is now. Like, you could say, well, they voted to leave the Soviet Union in 91, but that's not really the crucible that's going to create a national identity. What you need for that is a war. Well, okay, or something like a war. Well, Russia is giving them that now. And even if Russia gets battlefield victories, which they've had some, and presumably they could have more, and let's even assume they have a lot more. Like, let's even say that Russia conquers all of Ukraine, right? All the way, to the borders with Romania. Let's just say that happened. That would not obliterate the fact that they've created an independent Ukrainian identity. And there's many examples in history of countries getting totally losing, being crushed, having no victories to their name, which the Ukrainians already have many victories to their name, but just who still are able to use that as a mark of identity. I mean, the Chinese are in many ways identified with, because they lost all the wars in the 18th or the 19th century, the century of shame, so to speak. Like, the modern Chinese identity is largely based on it. Now, they have a previous identity too. Peter Zion says that the Chinese have a superiority complex because they just think that they're the greatest society that's ever existed. And they have this dissonance. Like, if we're the greatest society that ever existed, how come the English and the French and the Russians and the Japanese rode roughshod over us for 100 years and made fun of us and mocked us, right? And they don't like that. So that's why I think that the Russian war in Ukraine is just, it can't possibly succeed at this point, even if it had a military success at this point, which seems not impossible but unlikely. So Jimmy Carter is the most libertarian president. Yeah, Jimmy Carter is one of the best presidents we've had. Certainly one of the best ex-presidents. He did make some mistakes. There are lots of things not to like about him. But if you compare him to everybody after, it's hard not to see that he's the best in a very long time. Certainly the second half of the 20th century, and certainly better than anyone in the 21st century. He deregulated a ton of stuff, and we had all this nationalized airlines, nationalized telephone lines, nationalized television, and he deregulated like all of that stuff, even things like brewing. Did you see Glenn's debate with Dershowitz and Glenn's interview with Reason? I did see Glenn's interview with Reason. I thought that was very good. I couldn't bring myself to watch the debate with Dershowitz. Dershowitz is just such a piece of shit. I just can't stand watching him. Do you believe in technological singularity? No, not like a true singularity of all things. No. I mean, logically, who do you think is more draining on Russia or the USA? Oh, well, it's clearly on Russia. I mean, the United States is far, 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 far richer, more than 10 times richer, and is spending less. Like, the subsidies that we give to Ukraine are very small, and they're really kind of twisted in a way that they're just being used to update. And I'm not saying this to justify the subsidies. I totally, as much as I root for Ukraine, like, I can't actually make an argument that the United States needs to do this or has to do it. But they're just using them to retool and revamp our own industry, just like most of the subsidies. When you hear about $3 billion for Egypt and all this money for Saudi Arabia and all this money for Israel, it's very often us having them order new weapons from us and giving them old stocks. And that's definitely what's happening with Ukraine. Whereas Russia is really on a war economy at this point and has been. And that's, econometricians like to say, oh, spending's out, blah, blah, blah. But like, really, they're sacrificing wealth and treasure in a war. Right. And it's true that if they build a new T-90 tank, on paper, it's like, oh, GDP went up 5 million rubles because that's how much, or $5 million, because that's what the tank costs. And then that tank goes to Ukraine and it gets destroyed. Maybe it gets blown up, maybe it just wears out or gets stuck in a ditch or whatever. And that's not a benefit to society. That's just waste. It's just gone. And you could say, well, it was necessary. In the case of a war that you believe in, it's like, okay, maybe it was necessary. It's just part of the cost of getting what you want. but that's not good for the economy. This is even many. I mean, this is classic Keynesianism, but a lot of people here thought World War II got us out of the Depression. Like, no, during World War II, everything was worse. The standard of living went down. People worked more and got less, and all that excess production went into the war economy, which was used to win the war, but didn't make things materially better for anyone, except for those who were in the arms industry and got super wealthy out of it, which some people did. Uh, uh, Definitely would be more beneficial for the West to have a neutral Ukraine instead of Ukraine controlled by Russia. I guess. I mean, look, Ukraine was part of Russia for a long time, and it was part of the Soviet Union for a long time. And that's not to justify what's happening now, but to say that obviously we can live with that being part of Russia or Ukraine. Like, that's not an existential threat to us. Even if all of the Soviet Union was brought back, all the former USSR states were brought back to the Soviet Union, that would not be an existential threat to the United States. Because the Soviet Union was itself not. The only way that it was an existential threat is because it had nukes, and that has not really anything to do with how much territory they do or don't have. Population has been depleting. Yeah, the population of both are going down. They're both in very dire straits. In addition to the people who are dying, there are the people who are leaving. Something like over 1 million Russians have left, mostly young people. A huge number of Ukrainians have left, and they're trying to get the men to come back to draft them, which is understandable, but that won't really help their population. Those 4 million or 5 million people who left, and the 2 or 3 million that are still gone are mostly young women. And, what are the odds that they're going to have non-Ukrainian babies at some point I mean, many of them probably already have. So both countries are in great demographic decline, and the war is accelerating that. Probably there probably will be a baby boom after the war, but the odds that it's going to be enough to counteract the effects of the war are very, very small. Did the Confederacy develop an identity by the end of the war? It absolutely did. This is pretty well attested. Those states didn't have a unified civic identity before the war. They did have things like slavery, but slavery as an institution was not limited to the southern states that seceded. It also existed in the so-called border states, and it had a history in the non-border states. And there were states in the Confederacy that also had kind of seriously debated ending slavery in the decades before, especially Virginia. So yes, the war absolutely gave them an identity. It gave them heroes. It gave them a common history. So like all those battles that Robert E. Lee won, those many, many battles that he won, I'm using him as an example. It wasn't like it was just him. He had soldiers from all over the Confederacy, from Florida, from Texas, and they all got to take part in those victories and those defeats. And they had a common enemy, yeah, and then there seems to have been like this understanding, this common understanding at the end of the war, like, okay, you're back in the Union, you're going to be part of the United States, but we're not going to. You can still venerate and glorify the war. You can build statues to these guys. It is actually insane. I mean, Ken Burns has made this point. Also lives in New Hampshire, by the way, that Robert E. Lee killed far more Americans than Adolf Hitler did, or Tojo, or anyone, right? He's the number one killer of Americans ever, right? Like, how crazy is that? And yet his reputation is sterling, north or south. I mean, even people, I mean, was it U.S. Grant said, they fought with honor and in a cause they believed. And then he added, like, I just happened to believe it was the least deserving cause ever. Well, if that's really true, then they should have been, I mean, they should have suffered some kind of consequence, but none of them did, other than Henry Wirz. Henry Wirz was the commandant of so-called Andersonville prison. It was actually called Camp Sumter, but he was executed, but he was Swiss. He was a foreigner. Nobody else was executed, including Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis was imprisoned in Fortress Monroe. He was made to wear shackles for not long, a week or two, which you could say, as someone who had been a slave owner, was a poetic justice. He was supposed to go on trial. And, when they showed up for the arraignment or whatever, they just said, well, we're going to reschedule and we'll call you back. And they never did. And he never went to trial. We don't know exactly why. That some people argued that, well, we don't want to refight the war. Some people thought because the case would essentially become a legal fight about the validity of secession. That's what Jefferson Davis was going to make that the issue. And so one of the theories is they didn't want him to win in court because you could have the argument that secession is legal under the Constitution, I find extremely strong based on what the Constitution says and the way that it was ratified. Many of the states that ratified it said, we do this on the understanding that we can secede. It's in the New Hampshire Constitution that New Hampshire has the right to secede. Now, New Hampshire did not join the Confederacy because hasn't been slaves in the United States or in New Hampshire forever. But the legal case for secession is very strong. And it's even the case that, like, Lincoln didn't so much say, well, secession is illegal. He said that they attacked us, that the South attacked federal troops in Fort Sumter. And that's what we're really fighting about. Because, and not that and I'm sure that Lincoln was against secession as a legal concept, but it's shaky enough of a conclusion that that's not what they want. Anyway, the point is, sorry, tangent. The South to this day has a common identity that's based on that war, even though there's no one alive today who took part in it. Only the very oldest people alive today could have even met somebody who took part in it, and they would have been very young talking to a very old person. I think the last Confederate veteran died in the 50s. So, yeah, it absolutely can. And that's even if you lose the war. The South lost the war. They were defeated. They had lots of victories at the beginning, and then they got crushed. And yet their identity as Southerners remains. So that absolutely can and does happen. And it's certainly the only way to make it not happen would be if you somehow could obliterate the history, make it so that it never happened, erase it. But that's just not really possible anymore. So, yeah, I don't think that they have any chance. Even if there were all Russians, they should have always had the right to secede, but to secede to join NATO, the Rainbow Alliance. I'm not sure. It's just a joke. China produced anarchist philosophers. I don't know that much about Lao Tzu, so you could be right. Read How Nature Works by Per Bach, The Missing Piece in Libertarianism. What is that? The average African American makes 4 times what the average Russian makes on a weekly basis. Yeah, there's all these funny stats that like a quarter of Russians don't have like indoor toilets. They use outhouses. Like, Peter Zion will say that there's a degree of geographic determinism here. Maybe that's true, maybe not. But like, it's never been, in terms of standard of living and technology, it's never been a top tiered country. It's aspired to be that way, especially under people like Peter the Great or Catherine the Great. The Soviets definitely perceived themselves as being scientific and modern, but it just has never achieved that. In that book, The Threat, a really, really good book, it says that the Soviet Union was really like trying to copy the United States. It hated the United States, and it also envied the United States, and it constantly felt inferior to the United States because it was. The United States, for all of its flaws, for all the terrible things about the United States that we could, and I'd be the first to talk about and to litigate. It was better than the Soviet Union in basically every way, and it became just patently obvious even to people in the Soviet Union. Once it became obvious to people in the Soviet Union, that posed a huge problem. There was a point in the 50s where, or during Stalin, where people didn't know. I mean, people were like, they really believed that, that everyone in the West, that it was like chattel slavery and that they really had it better. And then actually World War II eventually was a big reason why that failed, because many millions and millions of Soviets went to Europe, right? And of course, they're going to places, many of which that had been destroyed by the war. The Soviet soldier who goes into Germany in 1946 is not seeing Germany at its best, to say the least. But they could tell that they had a much higher standard of living, basically in every way. And why is it? We're suffering all this tyranny in the Soviet Union, and this injustice, and this our own enslavement to the state. But if it's getting us something, if we're getting something transcendent out of that, and of course, Soviets, it's weird. This is a very weird thing about the Soviet Union. Its Marxist philosophy was explicitly materialist, right? It's about the workers and the means of production, and it's to make society better in terms of materialism. And it never, ever, ever delivered on that. But what it could do is have this philosophy, this sacrifice yourself to the greater good. And that was when it was strong. There's this element, it's still in the left today, of people who feel this motivate. Wow, we're making a better place for the world, right? And maybe we are doing horrible things. Maybe we are murdering children, or starving kulaks, or liquidating the wrong class, or whatever. And maybe that's ugly and terrible, and I have nightmares about it. But it's for this, to bring about this sublime, better, even perfect world, this utopia, or close to utopia. And that motivates a lot of people. And that's when it was really strong. So it's very strange. But that died in the generations after Stalin, the Brezhnevs and the Khrushchevs. I mean, Khrushchev maybe a little bit, but certainly by Brezhnev, they're just, oh no, we're just managing society, but they don't tap into that. And then when you just compare the two, it's like, it's obviously inferior, and then you get somebody like the pinnacle of this is someone like Boris Yeltsin, who, he was in the Communist Party, but he just, there's famous pictures of him visiting a supermarket in Texas. And he's just like, this is obviously better. I mean, what's the point of communism if it's just not as good? And Gorbachev is talking about making all these reforms that like might make it a shittier, more expensive, less efficient, like, copy of market capitalism. But he just could not believe in private property because he was a true Marxist, he was a true Leninist. And then took somebody who wasn't an intellectual, which Yeltsin was not an intellectual, to come in like, well, this is just stupid. It's just not as good. So, and then it just lost legitimacy. And, if you ever see I think it's now defunct, but the old former Soviet legal immigrant, he just talked about when he was a kid in Leningrad. I just want to live in a real country, man. We don't even have toilet paper. Like, we have to use newspapers to wipe our ass because there's no toilet paper. Like, why, like, and he had studied abroad. He lived in England, and he's like, it's a joke. We're not a real country. Now, Russia is not the Soviet Union, for good and for ill, right? It's not nearly as strong as the Soviet Union. It doesn't have a philosophy look, communism is wrong. Marxism is wrong. It's a horrible philosophy, but it is a philosophy. It can motivate people. It did motivate millions of people. Russian nationalism today, I'm not going to say it doesn't have a philosophy. It does, but it's a kind of Russian nationalism that has a limited appeal. Even within Russia, there are certainly people who do, but like, Russian nationalism is going to be diverse. Some of it's going to be just straight up Orthodox. Some of it is going to be dynastic imperialist, like, we need to have a czar. Some of it is coded Soviet still. Like, a lot of Russian nationalists are Soviets. I mean, I've seen interviews where people say Russia is one country. I was born in that country, and that country is the USSR. But of course, there are other Russians who hate the Soviet Union and say the Soviet Union was the worst thing that ever happened to Russia, which is true. So, but the problem with that is, what is the appeal of that to anyone who's not a Russian, right? Some of these people, they're chauvinists in the sense that they think that they love their country, which is fine. They love their language, which is fine. They love a lot of the art and history and literature. And there's no question that there's been a lot of really great Russian literature, most of it from the pre-Soviet era. There's been a lot of great Russian music. I'm a musician. A lot of phenomenal Russian music and operas. And, you got Tchaikovsky and Borodin and Shostakovich and Stravinsky and Mussorgsky and Rimsky-Korsakov. And there's just a huge, right. But then none of that means it's okay to kill hundreds of thousands of people. And also to just be like Russians. Some of them believe that Russia has this, I don't want to say manifest destiny, but like that it's the sole beacon of truth in the world. And like when they say stuff like that, they really are just being delusional. There's nothing about Russia that is more truthful than other countries. We can start talking about all the lies that the government tells, which all governments do. The United States government lies all the time as well. But we wouldn't go around saying, well, the United States is the beacon of truth and justice in the world. I mean, some people say that, and it's cringe when they say that, but it's not going to motivate other people. Other people are not going to like, oh yeah, please conquer me and rule me from Moscow because you're the third Rome. Because a Rurik Tsar married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor in 1450, as if the Ruriks were still a dynasty, or there was any dynasty in Russia, and even if there was, so the fuck what, that they can trace their ancestry back to a refugee from Constantinople. And they're very selective about that, by the way, because when the Metropolitan of the highest ranking person in the Orthodox Church says, well, the Kievan Church now has autocephaly and is not part of the Moscow Patriarchate. They're like, oh, well, he's just a fucking Turkish citizen. No one cares about him. Like, but it's true that he's not the Pope, Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, however you want to describe it. It's not structured the same way. He would be the first among equals, but still, it's a big deal when he says there's autocephaly in Ukraine now. Yeah, they're just delusional, and they love their own country so much, and they vested into the state. So you can love it, but there's a huge step to go. I love Russian poetry and music and literature and language and its history, and then therefore, whatever the state decides to do is right. Now they don't, right? So I don't know. It's nauseating, really. Despite being 4% of the population, Libertarians make up 50% of all communal showering posts. Depends how you measure that. I don't think that's true. The only communal shower advocacy groups that exist are basically run by me. And I'm a libertarian. People who have positive attitudes towards communal showering are few and far between, even within libertarianism. I can say that running them at Porcfest, they're not for most libertarians. I'll say that we have done well. We always have more people joining we've done it 3 years in a row, and every year it doubled. So I'm hoping to have that happen again. But yeah, there's nothing particularly libertarian about it, to be honest. Do you think that the aggressiveness of the trans movement has led to a backlash against gay people for being associated with them in LGBTQ? Well, I think there's definitely a backlash against trans people, and you're seeing a lot of the stuff about the child transition getting walked back. WPATH has been pretty explicitly exposed, and a lot of medical. It's sad that these medical societies and associations were so afraid of their image or getting canceled or whatever that they lent their credibility to something so abominable as child transition. But I feel like a lot of them are starting to come around to be like, hey, we're against this. So you're seeing this getting reversed in places like the UK and throughout the United States. I don't know about backlash against gay people. There are plenty of gay people. So some of the leading advocates against transing of kids have been like lesbians, because a big increase in the trans population has basically been lesbians getting transitioned into men. And some lesbians, I mean, I guess it's the case there is only 2 lesbian bars in the entire country at this point. I guess there were never as many as there were gay bars, but still, that's like huge. And there, it hasn't been. I have to say, I haven't noticed a lot of homosexual men criticizing the transing of kids. A few. I think that it hasn't. It didn't seem as existential to gay men though, because in the past, most trans people were male to female, and these would have been people more likely to be gay. Most of the increase, though, has been female to male, and so it hasn't seemed as existential, I think, to a lot of gay men. I don't think it's a backlash. In fact, if anything, I can see a lot of conservatives like uniting with gay people in agreement that the trans stuff is going too far, and it may actually have been building bridges, if anything, just because it's so outlandishly ridiculous. You know, it's one thing to be attracted to the same sex. It's another thing to have autogynephilia and then want to surgically alter babies or children to act out your sexual fantasy with, which, you know, that's the worst thing that you could characterize a gay person ever doing. So, yeah. Hey, you should read The Classical Liberal Case for Israel by Walter Block. Walter Block lost his libertarian status. Maybe I don't know. He is the classic case of a Zionist who cannot be objective when it comes to Israel. There are too many. I mean, there are many Jews, not all, right? I mean, okay, some of the best, most cogent, and powerful critics of Israel are Jewish. There's no doubt about it. Some of them are religious Jews, the Torah Jews against Zionism, right? Those guys have fought Zionism as hard as anyone, as long as it's existed, even though they are as Jew as you can be. And you have the secular Jews, the Norman Finkelsteins, the Max Blumenthals, the Glenn Greenwalds, the Sheldon Richmonds, right? A whole panoply of them who have written so many books and done so much activism. And there's a big part of that, right? So this is not a condemnation of all Jews, but and then of course, most Jews are like apathetic. If they live in the United States, it's, you know, they're doing their own thing, and whatever they feel or don't feel about Israel is like a marginal effect on their life. But then you have a big group that just emotionally identify, like, that's my place. This is the place for me. If I ever had to go there, they would go. I mean, I can't. I mean, there's Jews in America who do think, well, man, if there was a Holocaust, I'd have to go there, even though there's never been a Holocaust in the United States, at least for Jews. Pardon to the Native Americans out there who did experience Holocaust, but like, Jews have never been pogromed in the United States ever, not even remotely close, and it will never happen. So it's a mind virus that they could feel like that's even remotely plausible. And but yeah, so there's a lot of American Jews who just fetishize the fuck out of Israel, and I had someone at Porcfest tell me that Zionism is just like the Free State Project. It's just a bunch of Jews moved there and started to build their own society. Like, you missed the part where they ethnically cleansed everyone who was not in their way. And then they came and said, we're taking over. And, you know, it's funny. I was thinking about this today. You know how there's this big brouhaha about from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And there's like, you can't say that because it's genocide or whatever. And, sometimes it maybe does mean that, like many different people said. But ever notice if you listen to Ben Shapiro or these other Jews, they'll talk, instead of saying the West Bank, they'll say Judea and Sumeria, Judea and Samaria, Judea and Samaria, Judea and Sumeria. Why are they saying like, well, it's from the Bible. That's what it's called in the Bible. But like, that doesn't really convey that. What that means, that does not mean that, well, we're just going to go on the map and instead of West Bank or Transjordan or whatever, we're going to change the name and it's going to say Judea and Samaria. Boom. That's not what that really means. What that actually means is that there will be Jewish supremacy there. Now, they will say Jewish democracy. They will say a Jewish democracy because democracy is a good buzzword. But what do you mean Jewish democracy as opposed to just democracy? Like, why not just democracy? Well, just democracy would imply that, everyone there has equal rights and anyone can get elected and there can be political parties and they have different views and they're, it's democratic and you could have a left and a right and fringe parties and all kinds of different parties. Israel has many, many parties. It's not a two-party state like the United States essentially is. And that's not what Zionism wants. Zionism doesn't want democracy. It must be, quote, Jewish democracy. Well, what does that mean? It means that at the end of the day, no matter what, that Jews have to be the hegemon. They have to have ultimately the political power. Can others who are not Jews be involved? Yes. Non-Jews can exist. They don't all have to be exterminated. They can sometimes have roles in the government. Maybe they can have roles in the military. Maybe they can be elected, right? They can be elected to the Knesset. There are Arabs in the Knesset, but whatever their status and whatever their activity, no matter what, they must be subservient to Jews. They can never be an Arab prime minister. There can never be a coalition of non-Jewish political parties that have a majority in the Knesset. And so when they say Judea and Sumeria, what they are really saying is there will be Jewish supremacy here. And what does that look like? That could look like many different things. It could look like you have a Palestinian state, but it is bisected by a spider web of settlements and corridors between settlements and military bases that are all controlled not just by Jews, but by the most rabidly religious, ultra-Orthodox zealot Jews and the IDF. Or it could be that it's just straight up annexed and Israel will control that whole territory. And there are some Jews who just wish all the Palestinians there would be gone, whether that means they all be killed or that they all be forced to leave. They vary. Some of them, I think most of them are enough political savvy that they don't want to just murder all of them, even though there are Jews who will say that they have the right to do that, right? That all Goyim, all Gentiles are below snakes and can be killed. And the only good thing about a goy is that they maybe can help a Jew, and if they can't help a Jew, fuck them. Okay, so that's not all Jews, but like that is in the Talmud, and there are Jews who believe that, right? If you've ever seen the movie Munich about the anti-terrorism operations, there's a line in there where one of these secular sounding Jews just says, well, the only blood that matters is Jewish blood. And you can feel that way, that's fine, but like everyone else is going to think, well, fuck that person. Right. This is, by the way, why Judaism has always been a small religion, because it doesn't have a mass appeal. Like Islam doesn't say, oh, only people who are Arab can be true Muslims, or everyone else is just inferior to, unless you're part of not even Arab, but like the house that Muhammad's from, you're just inferior. No, they don't think that way. And Christians the same way. So, yeah. It's just funny that you can't say from the river to the sea, but you can say Judea and Samaria, just like when the Russians refer to Novorossiya. When they say Novorossiya, they're not just saying, well, we're going to change the name and that's it. No, they're saying this place must be governed by Moscow because Peter the Great conquered it in 1705 from the Turks. Right. So yeah. Uh, have you talked about what happened to Walter Block yet? I just did. Oh, I did not know his senior title from the Mises Institute was removed. Yeah, was it Hop? Somebody wrote an article and said, because he basically says we the Jews bought the land. And like, what do you mean we the Jews? Who are the Jews and who are the yeah? Uh, and it's funny, Mises was a Jew. A lot of the Austrians were Jews, and like that's fine, but they're not Zionists. And that's the other thing. Zionism, again, there's many historically there have been many strains of Zionism, and they're not all identical. Right? There were strains of Zionism that were much more pan-Semitic, right? That didn't necessarily believe in Jewish supremacy. They're like, the Semites are our brothers. Early Zionism was like, hey, our enemies are the Christians. Man, the Christians are the one who are trying to wipe us out, except for the American Christians. They're cool. But and Arab states in the preceding couple hundred years had been, if anything, pretty accommodating and moderate to Jews, especially compared to Christians. I mean, the stuff in Eastern Europe, the stuff in Russia, the stuff in Iberia, at the end of the Reconquista, those Catholic monarchs in Spain, I mean, they went back on their promises. I mean, at one point when Ferdinand had said, hey, you can keep your religion, just be a good subject and we're good. And then, a couple of years later, it's like, no, you have to convert or we'll kill you or you leave. And a lot of Jews left Spain. It's hundreds of thousands of Jews left Spain and found refuge all over the Arab world, especially in the Ottoman Empire. But those types of Zionism have kind of their historical footnotes at this point. Zionism, as it exists as a political philosophy today, it is centered on there being a Jewish state, right? And so, Walter Block once joked that he's an anarchist, except he thinks there should be a government that makes people read Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. There's a funny video of him talking about that. Mises Institute maybe 15 years ago came out with a new edition of Economics in One Lesson, and they interviewed all their staff, including him, and that was kind of like the joke. But when you're a serious Zionist like he is, like he obviously believes in a Jewish state. Like he's not talking about he's not talking about anarcho-capitalist Zionism, which I would be all in favor for. My grandfather came over from Poland to Canada in 1916. He said his first few years were bad enough. Considered going back. Wasn't until he started working for himself that he had a decent living. Well, Canada is a terrible country, so that's not surprising. I don't think Walter Block's position is motivated by him being Jewish. Okay. Okay. I mean, he might not be self-conscious about it. That's the problem. What group do you think has a bigger influence on GOP's support for Israel, the evangelicals or the neocons? I think the neocons. I don't think the evangelicals are that strong of a political force. There are millions of them out there, but they will vote for the Republican no matter what. So I don't think evangelicals are going to not vote for a Republican because, whereas the neocons will straight up switch parties to become Democrats. They'll do whatever it takes to be Israel first. Yeah. Do you like the comedian Dave Smith having an influence on the Libertarian Party? I don't have a problem with it. I think I disagree with Dave on a couple things, but I think it's the whole thing with the Mises Caucus and then them losing and to his credit, he took it is his fault. Like the whole point of the Mises Caucus essentially was to run him as president this cycle. And he all but seemed to have made that decision, and then brought the whole thing with Reno when they took control of the party 2 years ago, was a stepping stone to him being the nominee, which he could have done if he had chosen to do it. And they embarked on the strategy, and they got halfway through, and then he decided not to run for president. And he maybe had very good reasons to do that with his family, which you can almost respect him more for prioritizing his family over his political ambitions, which, to be fair, he would be the first to admit that's not really a political ambition in the sense that he gave up his chance to be president because he knows he wouldn't become president. But then that put the Mises Caucus in a really weird position, because there was nobody even close to Dave's status or stature to take his place. And so he's bitching and moaning about Michael Rectenwald, or I'm sorry, Chase, whatever his name is. And yet it is, and he has admitted it's basically his fault. I mean, he could have stopped it, and he made other decisions, maybe understandable ones that we shouldn't hate him for, and I don't hate him for. But yeah, in terms of like the Civil War and the Libertarian Party, I mean, look, I have policy disagreements. I'm more open borders. I'm like than say the Mises Caucus people are, for example. I don't think that I agree with them on all the culture war stuff, even though I do agree on like the abortion stuff. But it is true that like there's an element of the Libertarian Party that is like strangely like Democrats who are just good on budgets or whatever. And I know some of those people, like Joe Bishop Henchman. I don't know him well, but I kind of, we're in the same circles. I know people who are friends with him. I've talked with him a couple times, and I know his husband, and like, I mean, on top of like having Trump derangement syndrome, some of their takes were just hard to take seriously, so as far as that goes, I fall more on the Mises Caucus. But it's the Libertarian Party. Like, I just don't think it matters very much. I also noticed that Reason is subtly or not so subtly very biased. They have done a lot of reporting on the Chase getting elected, and you'll notice in the interviews, like whenever they show a Mises Caucus person, they'll play like this frumpy dumpy music, like dum boom boop 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 boop. But then when they interview Chase, they make it sound like snappy and he's serious, and it's like it's all a clown show. There are forms of Zionism, namely non-state Zionism. Well, I mentioned that. I know that that's a rich history, and that, look, I mean, Theodore Herzl talked about converting to Catholicism, and he didn't circumcise his sons, and I'm all in favor of that. But the type of Zionism that ended up winning out and taking over Israel is state Zionism. And if you meet a Zionist, you're not going to meet many Zola Hedrick Zionists. You're going to meet state Zionists, And if you want to make an exception and be like, well, for that sliver that are not like that, fair enough. But that's just not how most of them are. Chase Oliver is anti-circumcision. That's good. And I saw when he was talking about that Dave Smith is also anti-circumcision, but that's the first time I ever heard him talk about it. He did a retrospective on the whole thing, and it was interesting. Again, I've talked about this many times, certainly with Ben Shapiro and what's his name? Who's the bearded guy at the Daily Wire? Well, you know who I mean. They will talk about the evils of transitioning kids, and the language they use 100% would apply to male circumcision. Oh, Matt Walsh. Sorry, Matt Walsh. And it doesn't it doesn't seem to register at all. In fact, we know in the case of Ben that he's in favor of circumcision. I don't know if Matt Walsh is or not. Listening to Dave talk about Chase and, his favoring the transition of children, I was again having the same, like, man, everything he's saying would apply to circumcision. And then Chase brought it up in an interview, and then Dave kind of said, "Oh yeah, I'm against that also." So that's the first I ever heard him talk about it. I can see why maybe it's not his issue or whatever, but like, if you think that it's wrong, it's true that it's not as invasive as transition. Transition is much more invasive, but it's also vastly more common, right? As much as we've seen an increase in trans surgeries for kids, and we have, and it's bad, and I all the agree, like, we're still looking at over 50% of our newborn boys getting circumcised, right? More than 1 million a year, a couple million a year, I think. So, yeah, I don't understand. It seems like then if that's really true, it's just like the abortion thing. Like if you decide that abortion is actually homicide, which it is, then that's a big deal. Like that has massive implications that are worth speaking about. And if a baby can't consent to having their foreskin removed and it's not medically justified, then it is a major, major violation of that baby's rights. Even if you could say consequentially that there isn't a major downside, right? That the harm is minimal or whatever, it's still a major, major ethical violation. And so I'm kind of curious, like, why there is a disconnect there, because I've never heard him speak about. No, I don't listen to every Dave Smith podcast, so maybe it's come up more than I know. But I mean, just I was seeing Brian Kaplan was interviewed by Chris Williamson a couple months ago, and Chris just offhand recommended, "Oh, I know that you're also against circumcision." And it turns out that Brian Kaplan is pretty much been against circumcision for a really long time, but he hasn't made it like a big point of his work. I love the pronunciation. Yeah, well, my Hebrew is really bad, as in I don't have any. So, all right, so we're getting kind of late here. Are any of you going to go to Porcfest? I'm going to be there. I'll be running the pork showers because I have the last 3 years. And I'm really looking forward to it. It should be really good. We've doubled every single year. I've been working with the Porcfest organizers quite a bit. There's a lot of logistical cooperation that's happening, and it should be a lot of fun. I don't even know what speakers are going to be there, but if you guys are going to go, you should definitely come say hi. So it'll be pork showers, Site 51, RV Site 51 at Rogers Campground. And I'll be there all week. I'm actually going the weekend before. I'm driving down Friday night. I'll be setting up Saturday and Sunday. How do you know that they're nice showers? FedEx Pope. What even is Porcfest? Oh my. Porcfest is it's the Libertarian Burning Man. It is the largest event put on by the Free State Project every year. It takes place for 1 week at the end of June, or maybe the penultimate week of June. And it is an eclectic mix of speakers on topics, all types of topics, from beekeeping to gun rights to homeschooling to economics to Bitcoin to crypto to war to drug policy, every libertarian, copyright, objectivism versus Austrian versus Chicago, David Friedman versus versus Bob Murphy, Tom Woods, Dave Smith, Jeffrey Tucker, I don't know if Brian Kaplan's ever gone, but Jacob Huber, or Michael Humer, excuse me, and a lot of petty capitalism, a lot of child labor, a lot of child entrepreneurship, drugs, guns, crafts, food, fire. Just it's a crazy, crazy event, and something that everyone should experience at least once. if not many times. Does that answer your question? Look up the Porcupine Freedom Festival online and you'll find the site. Porcfest. Mm-hmm. Have any of you ever been to Porcfest? I think Pentazoid, you've been there, right? Or Steven? Cinefan, you should go to Porcfest. You've never gone, have you? Nope. Oh. You know, since I don't know what like any of you guys look like, when people, some people, oh, I watch your channel, but I almost never know who they are. So I just remembered it now. That brought it up. Do you still work in the oil fields? No, I haven't done that in many years now. I've been wanting to go. I mean, people come from all over the world. Israelis, Europeans, English people all over the United States, Canadians, Brazilians, Norwegians, like everything, all over the United States. It's like a great libertarian gathering from all over the world, and it's such a weird mix of like, let's have intellectual debate, and then somebody doing DMT or microdosing or having a dance party. It's also strangely like super kid friendly. Like a lot of families come and bring their kids, and I've actually known multiple people, like they started going as bachelors and now they've got families and they're bringing their kids. I even heard of people who had like ideological disputes with the FSP, with the Free State Project, who didn't want to go anymore, but their kids like going so much that they had to keep going. Newborns? Yeah. I mean, a newborn isn't going to enjoy it because a newborn is, a neonate, but like, yes, there are babies there. Do I like Michael Malice? Well, I've only met him once, and he's a bit of a prick, but I think that's just his personality. I don't like his style, but like his content is fine. And we have a lot of mutual friends, actually. Yeah, Michael Malice went to Porcfest, I think, in like 2013 or 2014. And then there's actually a conversation he had with Dave Smith, where Dave Smith had gone, and Michael was asking if he should go back. But at the time, Michael was very much a New Yorker who felt out of water not being in New York City, and maybe now that he's a Texan, he can handle it better. Diverse in thought and in background. Yeah, we have many left libertarians. You have objectivists. There's a lot of Jews there. There's pagans there. There's Christians there. Gay, trans, not trans, trans with guns, gay, anarchists, Arabs, everything, right? The Mises Cock, the people who hate the Mises Cock, libertarians, Republicans, locals. A lot of locals come. I remember once there was a guy brandishing a double-bladed axe with a New Hampshire flag, and it's like, "Are you a Free Stater?" It's, "No, I'm not a Free Stater, but the Free Staters love New Hampshire, and I love New Hampshire, so we're all friends," or whatever. So, yeah. It's quite an eclectic mix, and it's a lot of fun, and you meet a lot of cool people and make friends. So, yeah, I recommend everybody go. All right, it's getting late. Got to get up early. Any final questions from everyone? Watch, I'm going to count down and someone's going to say, what will you do now? What do you mean? I'm going to go to bed after I finish this. Yeah, I don't understand what you're asking there, FedEx Pope. All right. 3, 2, 1. Oh, sleep is overrated, maybe, but it's so is air. But you're not going to see me stop breathing. So, I speak a little bit of a couple languages, but none of them very well. I'll say that. All right. Do побачення.